switch is flipped or the trapdoor is released. But sometimes life throws a curveball and spares even the most heinous of people. Executions are intended to be a criminal's final moments, but there have been those that have escaped their planned death as if to spit in the face of the system that put them there. Sometimes it's a temporary escape, as the system always seems to get its way. But these survivors of their own execution are a fascinating breed that have done the impossible. Or maybe their devious acts are just the makings of my own twisted imagination. It's time to be put to the test to see just how perceptive you really are. Are the following tales fact or fiction?
The line that divides the factual from the unreal has long since blurred. The tales we once thought fantastical, now implanted as truth. To decipher verity from the imagined, you must break from the ordinary and consider a universe where the outlandish prevails. Can you expand your mind to see beyond our perceived reality? Can you decide what's fact or fiction?
My first story is that of a literal man of steel. He may not be faster than a speeding bullet, but he's apparently stronger than one. After being captured by Confederate soldiers during the Civil War, Tim Daly found himself staring down multiple rifles, something that, for many, would have been a guaranteed death sentence.
The scar that makes up the bulk of Tim Daly's face was a shocking one, but maybe no more shocking than the events that led to its formation. At the height of the Civil War, Daly had found himself separated from his fellow Union soldiers, forced to flee from the persistence of the Confederate troops that seemed to hunt him at every turn. He didn't make it far before being picked up by the enemy. But that's not where his unfortunate story ends. Not long after his capture, Daly received the word he had expected, that there would be no alternate options for him. Without convening and deciding a fair and just sentence, the young soldier was immediately sentenced to death. An enemy to the Confederates' cause, there was no place for him in the world they hoped to create. With no more than enough food to barely keep him alive until his execution, Daly faced a definite end brought on by his dedication to a cause he would never live to see fulfilled. When his time came, on the 18th day of the 3rd month of the year 1863, the Union soldier wasn't ready to die, but there would be no escape from the firing squad that stood in front of him. He stared down the barrels of each rifle, wondering which would wind up firing first, just to be the man that shot down the Union prisoner. The process was slow, certainly slower than it needed to be, but eventually the order to fire came. Daly felt the first 2 bullets hit him and punched through the flesh of his chest. Another struck him in the shoulder before any semblance of pain was masked by the fear of his imminent death. He heard 9 gunshots and could feel his blood oozing from each of the 9 successful hits. He squirmed against his restraints and struggled to keep his head up, but he could hear the footsteps loud and clear as they approached. One final gun was fired, this one much closer than the others, and he felt the impact strike the right side of his face. Daly could feel the life slipping from him, but his mind refused to give in. Even as the world around him turned black, he was still alive. The last thing he could feel was his body being lifted, dragged, and eventually tossed on an unknown pile. Hours later, still bleeding, his face mangled from that final shot, Daly regained consciousness. From the pile of bodies he was thrown onto, he struggled against weakness, blood loss, and the persistence of death, and used every bit of strength he had to crawl away. When Daly's bloody figure happened upon the church several blocks away, he was lucky enough to have been spotted by a generous church member. Daly's wounds were tended to, and he eventually recovered from the impossible. And while he never returned to the fight, he did eventually see that world he had been fighting for.
Was Tim the 50 Cent of the American Civil War? What do you think? Was this a tale of my imagination, or an event rooted in history? Leave a comment with your thoughts and be sure to vote in the on-screen poll. We'll get to the reveal in a moment, but I still have two more strange stories to tell of people who were able to survive their death penalty. The next one follows Robert Grossman, a mid-19th century killer that found himself on the wrong end of the law, and a vengeful father.
It wasn't uncommon for small towns in times past to hang their criminals publicly. In fact, everyone would come out to observe the spectacle, something of a crude form of entertainment. But when it came to Robert Grossman, the alleged murderer of Tiffany Jacobs, the rural town of Owensboro wasn't there for the show. They were there to make sure that sick SOB didn't somehow escape his sentencing. Within the crowd was Tiffany's father, Isaac. He was known throughout the Midwestern town as a gentleman, a man that would give someone the shirt off his back to help someone in need. But any sign of kindness he once had vanished with the death of his girl. Now, as he stared down Grossman, watching as the executioner tightened the noose around his neck, his eyes burned with anger. There was no ceremony to Grossman's execution. With few words said about him, he was dropped and the rope pulled tautly. Grossman instinctively kicked as if to find a solid surface, futilely pulling the rope from his neck. Even to those watching, his death seemed to take longer than expected. As Grossman's body continued to move and his throat gargled, Isaac stepped out from the crowd, lifted a pistol he had stowed, and fired a round into the killer's chest. The chaos that followed ended with Grossman's still body lying bloodied and on the ground, and Isaac carted off for endangering those around him. Though he left under the assumption that Grossman had died, as did those that cut him down and much of the crowd that gathered to watch, he still impossibly drew breath. It wasn't something Owensboro had ever experienced, but Grossman's gunshot wound was tended to and he was eventually nursed back to health. Whether an attempt was to be made on his life again became a debated narrative throughout the small town, with much of it leaning heavily towards yes. In that time it was taking to decide, the killer's heart still beat. And though Isaac had been locked up and left tormented at the thought of his daughter's killer still alive, Tiffany's father had his own supporters. It was a quiet night in town when half a dozen people made their way to the small jail where Grossman remained. The group of people, a blend of Tiffany's extended family and concerned friends of the family, took the jail as theirs that night for one purpose: to free Isaac and allow him the chance for revenge once again. While they expected resistance from the local law officers, those watching over the cells that evening were also keen on helping Isaac deliver much-needed vengeance, which, with one bullet to the killer's temple, he fulfilled.
Well, that's some luck Grossman seemed to have. But was it real? That is, did a man like Grossman survive the gallows and a gunshot, only to be murdered in a communal act of revenge later on? Leave your thoughts in the comments and vote in the poll before we move on to one final story. This one may have you pondering the argument of the inhuman nature of the death penalty. Does a man guilty of murder deserve to suffer? Keep that question in the back of your mind as we look into the case of Darren Garner, convicted murderer and death row inmate.
there was no denying that Garner had done it. At only 16 years old, he had committed a heinous crime and murdered a local drugstore owner, Francis Williams, in New Orleans. For months after the crime, however, Garner lived a free life as the investigation pointed police in every direction but his. That is, until he was detained for a lesser and unrelated crime. As police started to search his personal effects, they found Williams's wallet. It didn't take long or even much prodding from the officers for Garner to confess. After the brief interrogation, he confessed his guilt in writing and started to dish out details on the murder. During his trial, though, his tune changed and he pled not guilty. The jury wasn't convinced, especially when his state-appointed attorney called no witnesses and let the prosecution tie him to the murder. By the time the trial had closed, Garner had been convicted of murder and sentenced to death. In May of 1946, he was scheduled to be executed via the electric chair, prepared as any other death row inmate would be just prior to execution. Garner's death was intended to be quick. But as the current started coursing through his body, witnesses to the execution claimed they heard him crying for reprieve, even exclaiming, "I'm not dying." Sure enough, he wasn't dying. According to the inspection done to the portable electric chair afterward, it hadn't been properly set up. An intoxicated prison guard and prison inmate were responsible for the slip-up, and as many people feared, for allowing a killer to walk. Garner didn't have it that easy, however. Despite the help of a lawyer who touted the execution as cruel and unusual punishment, Garner's appeals went unapproved. Within a year, almost exactly to the day, he returned to the chair for a successful execution.
Shouldn't the botched execution have led to a change in Garner's sentence to life in prison? I'd like to know what you think. So while you're determining whether or not this tale was based on a true story, make your way to the comments and let me know. Also, be sure to vote in the on-screen poll, because we've come to that time, that moment that you've been waiting for, the reveal.
Are you ready to find out if you can decipher between fact or fiction? Let's look back at tonight's 3 stories and find out which were born from reality and which were fabrications of the imagination.
Let's go back to the beginning, to the story of Tim Daly, the Union Civil War soldier that survived the firing squad. Clearly, that was a story I cooked up all on my own, right? Well, not entirely. Change out Tim Daly for Wenceslao Mogel and the American Civil War for the Mexican Revolution, and you have yourself a true story. Wenceslao is recognizable due to the scar left by the final close-range bullet. In 1937, Mogel went on the Ripley's Believe It or Not radio show to tell his story. So if that story is true, what does that say about our next one? About the vengeful father and the near-impervious murderer? Did Robert Grossman survive the gallows and a gunshot wound? No, he didn't. Actually, in fact, the entire story was completely created by yours truly. That leaves us with story number 3, that of murderous Darren Garner. Do you think he suffered a botched execution only to be faced with the chair again? For that answer, I point you to Supreme Court case Francis versus Westweber. The man was Willie Francis, and yes, he did survive his execution due to a poorly set up chair, thanks to an intoxicated guard. Francis attempted to appeal his sentence after the mishap, but 1 year and 6 days later, he was back on the chair again. This time, he wouldn't survive.
How well did you do in tonight's video? Did you look past the deception of our world and define the off-blurred line that struggles to separate lies from the truth? Let us know in the comment section below. And should you find the urge to test your perceptions again, be sure to subscribe and join us next time when we ask you to decide what's fact or fiction.